A Thursday morning, salt heavy in the air, first light barely reaching a village carved into coastal cliffs that had no business being found by anyone. The kind of place that exists between maps, between worlds, between the attentions of men who move through life like storms. And yet, at exactly 5:47 a.m., the most powerful man in Sicily stood barefoot on wet stone, shoes discarded somewhere behind him on the narrow path down the hill, his €1,000 suit wrinkled from 12 hours of driving, his eyes locked on a window glowing faint amber through the fog. He had not slept. He had not eaten. He had not spoken a word to anyone since leaving Palermo, and the silence inside him was louder than anything the sea could offer. Through the glass, movement. A shadow passing back and forth in a small kitchen, unhurried, familiar with its space. Then a smaller shadow, lower, quicker, bumping against something and laughing at the collision. The sound traveled thin and fragile through the morning air, and it stopped him cold. That laugh, high and unguarded and completely without fear. His hands tightened at his sides, not into fists, into something closer to prayer. Severo Catanese had buried men for less than a whispered insult. He had restructured the power balance of 3 provinces before his 35th birthday. He had once sat across from a federal prosecutor and smiled until the man forgot every question he had prepared. Now he stood outside a fisherman's cottage with no socks on, afraid to knock on a door. The lock turned from inside. The door opened inward, letting warm kitchen light spill out across the stone threshold, and she was there. Mirren. Not the way he remembered her, not the version of her that still lived behind his eyes whenever the world got too quiet. That version had been softer, more uncertain, always slightly off balance in a way that made everyone around her feel steadier. The woman standing in front of him now was none of those things. Her hair was shorter, tied back with a strip of cloth. Her hands were rough. Her posture was different, not guarded exactly, but grounded, rooted, like she had grown into the stone beneath her feet. She looked at him the way the sea looks at the shore, patient, unimpressed, and fully capable of destruction. Then the boy appeared beside her, small, dark-haired. Not yet 3, but carrying himself with a stillness that belonged to someone older. He stepped halfway behind her leg, one hand gripping the fabric of her dress, the other holding a wooden spoon like it was the most important object in the world. Severo's breath didn't leave him all at once. It left in pieces, each one pulled from somewhere deeper than the last, as if his body was trying to disassemble itself from the inside out. The boy's face, the jaw, the brow, the way his head tilted slightly to the left when he looked up, assessing, calculating, measuring the stranger against every safe thing he knew, and his eyes, dark, sharp, unmistakable. Severo's eyes stared back at him from a face too young to carry them. The realization didn't build, it detonated. His mouth opened, but no sound came. His lungs worked, but the air didn't reach. Every instinct he had, control, command, certainty, collapsed into a single, unbearable truth. He has a son. Mirren's hand moved to the boy's shoulder, not pulling him back, but anchoring him. The gesture was small, automatic, and devastating. "Mama," the boy said quietly, still watching, still holding the wooden spoon. "Who is that man?" She didn't hesitate. She didn't look away from Severo. Her voice came out steady and clear, like she had carved it from years of silence. "Nobody," she said. "He's at the wrong house." And Severo felt something crack open inside his chest that he didn't know still existed. He tried to speak. Her name started forming in his throat, but it came out fractured, broken across syllables that no longer fit together the way they used to, like a language he had forgotten and was trying to relearn in the worst possible moment. "Mirren." Don't. One word. No volume behind it, no sharpness, just weight. The kind of weight that doesn't come from power, but from practice. She had rehearsed this. Maybe not this exact moment, but the shape of it. The boundaries. The wall she would need if it ever arrived. She had been ready for him. That realization stung worse than the door she was already beginning to close. Please, he said. A word that hadn't crossed his lips in years. A word that men in his world treated like surrender. He didn't care. Pride was something that happened to other people now. The boy tilted his head again, eyes narrowing slightly. He didn't speak, didn't move from behind her leg, but something in his gaze shifted. Not fear, not curiosity. Recognition. The kind that lives in blood and bone and doesn't need explanations. You need to leave, Mirren said, her hand still resting on the boy's shoulder, her body positioned between them like a wall made of everything she had survived without him. There's nothing here for you. That's not true. His voice was raw, stripped of every layer that usually protected it. The voice that brokered silence in rooms full of dangerous men was now standing in the fog, begging a woman in a cotton dress to let him stay. You don't know anything about what's true, she said. And there it was. Not anger. Something older than anger. Something that had been forged in years he hadn't been there to witness, hardened by nights he couldn't imagine, and sharpened against the memory of exactly what he had taken from her. I know he's mine. The words fell between them like a stone into still water. She flinched. Not visibly, not in any way the boy would notice, but he saw it. A fracture so brief it could have been imagined. Then it sealed shut again, locked behind the expression of a woman who had learned to survive by never letting anything reach her twice. He's mine, she corrected. Quiet. Final. He's been mine every day you weren't here. Every fever, every nightmare, and every morning he asked questions I didn't have answers to. Mine. The word hit him harder than any fist ever had. The boy tugged gently on her dress. Mama, is he lost? Her jaw tightened. Something flickered in her eyes. Not softness, not yet, but the echo of something she was actively refusing to feel. Yes, she said, quieter now, her gaze never leaving Severo's. He's very lost. Then why doesn't he go home? Silence. Severo looked at the boy, at his son, at the child who had grown up in a world without him, in a house without guards, in a life built entirely on the strength of a woman who had walked away from everything and never looked back. Because, Severo said softly, his voice barely holding, I think this is home. The door closed, not slammed, closed. Gently, deliberately, like the careful sealing of something that should never be opened again. The lock turned, and the most powerful man in Sicily stood alone on the wet stone, the fog thickening around him, his son's voice still echoing through the morning air. He didn't knock again. He didn't call her name. He lowered himself onto the bottom step, his back against the cold wall of the cottage, and he stayed. Because somewhere behind that door, a boy was holding a wooden spoon and asking questions about a stranger who looked like him. And Severo realized that for the first time in his life, he had found something no amount of power could take back by force. Inside, faintly, the boy's voice again. Mama, why does the lost man look so sad? A pause. Then her voice, quieter, tighter, barely a thread. Because some people don't know they're lost until it's too late. And outside, the man who had never begged for anything pressed his palms against his eyes and did not move. She had been the 23rd secretary to walk through his door. The first 22 had lasted days, some only hours. One left mid-dictation. Another cried in the elevator. A third never returned from lunch and was later found working at a shoe shop in Catania, telling customers she had never been happier. Severo Catanese did not shout or threaten. What he did was worse. He expected perfection at a pace that made perfection feel like mediocrity, and he moved through the world with a controlled intensity that made the air around him feel thinner, harder to breathe. No one stayed. No one could. And then she walked in. I did not belong there. I knew that the moment the elevator doors opened onto a floor that smelled like leather and old money and something colder underneath. Everything was polished, precise, ruthlessly ordered. I tripped on the threshold, just enough for my bag to slip from my shoulder, spilling pens, loose papers, a cracked phone case, and a single tangerine that rolled all the way to his office door. I picked everything up and walked into his office carrying the tangerine because there was nowhere else to put it. He was standing at the window when I entered, his back to the room, his silhouette cut against the Palermo skyline like something carved from marble and bad decisions. He didn't turn around. "You're the replacement," he said. Not a question. "I'm the applicant," I corrected, because technically no one had offered me the position yet, and accuracy seemed important in a place where everything else felt dangerously imprecise. He turned then, slowly, like he was giving me time to reconsider. His eyes found mine, and for a second, everything inside me went very still. Not because he was intimidating, though he was, profoundly, but because there was something behind the control, something behind the sharpness, that looked exactly like exhaustion. He looked at the tangerine in my hand. "That's not standard interview equipment." "It's not a standard interview." Something moved in his expression. Not a smile. Men like him didn't smile in rooms like this. But something adjacent. Something that existed in the space between amusement and disbelief. I should have been afraid. Everyone who stood in that room was afraid. But fear requires a kind of awareness I have never been good at. I have always been better at noticing the wrong things. The dust on a shelf no one looks at. The way someone's hand moves when they're lying. I notice everything except danger. That was my gift. It was also my undoing. He hired me. Not because I was qualified. I was barely that. Not because I was impressive. I knocked over his coffee within the first hour, misfiled an entire week of correspondence by the second day, and once answered a call from a man who controlled the narcotics corridor of eastern Sicily by saying, "Good morning, how can I help you?" in the tone of a cheerful receptionist. But I stayed. And that was enough. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. I learned the rhythm of his world, not the violence, not the machinery beneath the surface, but the human architecture of it. The way he drank his coffee standing up because sitting meant staying. The way his voice changed on certain calls, dropping into something lower, something that sounded like a man walking through a room full of glass. I noticed everything. I always had. And somewhere between the dropped files and the quiet late nights when the building emptied and it was just the two of us, he started noticing me too. Not as a secretary, as something else. Something that existed in the pauses between sentences, in the look that lasted one beat too long before he turned back to the window. 11 months. That was how long it took for the world to feel like it belonged to both of us. And then, I opened the wrong drawer. It was a Tuesday. Late. Rain against the windows, the building mostly empty. He was in a meeting 3 floors down. I was organizing his office, something I did when I was restless, when my hands needed purpose. The bottom drawer of his private desk was locked. It had always been locked. I had never questioned it. But that night, the key was there, sitting on the desk, beside his coffee cup, ordinary and unguarded. I told myself I was simply tidying up, putting the key back where it belonged. That was the first lie. The drawer opened smoothly. Inside, folders, documents, names I didn't recognize, financial records that meant nothing to me. And then, beneath everything, A single file held together with a black clip. My father's name. The room tilted. Not physically, but in the way the world shifts when something you believe to be solid turns out to be hollow. I stared at the name, my name, printed on a document that had no reason to exist in this desk, in this building, in this life. I opened it, and everything I had built, every feeling, every trust, every moment I had allowed myself to believe that the man downstairs was someone I could love without consequence, collapsed like it had never been real. My father's death, detailed, annotated, connected to an order that traced back to this office, this desk, this man. The man I loved had killed the man who raised me. And I had been sleeping beside the answer for 11 months without knowing. I did not cry. That is the part people never understand when I tell them. Not that I left, but that I didn't break first. The document sat in my hands for what felt like hours but was probably seconds, each word burning itself into memory with the kind of permanence that no amount of distance would ever soften. My father's name, the date, the method, the authorization. And then I closed the file, placed it back exactly as I had found it, shut the drawer, and returned the key to the precise spot beside his coffee cup. My hands did not shake. They should have. Everything inside me was collapsing, slowly, methodically, like a building that had been rigged to fall floor by floor instead of all at once. But my hands stayed steady because they had to, because shaking meant feeling, and feeling meant stopping. And stopping meant he would find me here with the truth written across my face before I had the chance to do the only thing left to do. Leave. I sat at my desk, opened a file on the screen, adjusted the lamp, and waited. When the elevator chimed 20 minutes later and his footsteps came down the corridor, I looked up the way I always did. He paused at my desk, fingers brushing the edge of the wood. "Still here?" he asked. "Someone has to be," I replied, and the words tasted like ash, but they sounded like every other sentence I had ever spoken in this office. He moved past me into his office. I heard the chair shift, the desk drawer open, and my heartbeat climbed so high I was certain it would give me away. But nothing happened. He found nothing disturbed. I waited 40 minutes. I finished the false task on my screen. I stood, collected my coat, and told the night guard I was going home early because I wasn't feeling well. He nodded. He didn't write it down. People like me, assistants, secretaries, the quiet machinery that kept powerful men on schedule, were invisible when we chose to be. The building released me the way buildings always do at night, with indifference. No alarms, no locked doors, no barriers designed to keep someone like me inside. Every security measure in that tower had been built to stop enemies, not the woman who scheduled their appointments. I didn't go to the apartment. The apartment was his, furnished with his money, located in his building, monitored by his people. Everything in my life had been threaded through him so completely that pulling one strand loose would have unraveled the rest before I reached the street. Instead, I went to the only place that had ever been mine alone. A locker at the Central train station, rented 6 months earlier on a morning I couldn't explain, paid for with cash I had set aside in small amounts that would never be noticed. Inside, a bag with clothes, documents, enough money to disappear for a few weeks, and a photograph of my father that I had carried since I was 17. I didn't know why I had prepared it, not consciously, but the part of me that noticed everything, the part that saw dust where others saw nothing, that heard hesitation in voices that sounded certain, that part had known something was wrong long before I found the proof. I took the bag. I left everything else behind. I didn't look at the photograph. Not yet. Looking would mean grieving, and grieving would mean staying still long enough to be found. The last train south departed at 11:40 p.m. I boarded with 7 minutes to spare, chose a seat facing away from the platform, and watched Palermo disappear through rain-streaked glass like a city being erased. I did not look back. That was the promise I made myself. Seated in the dim light of a half-empty carriage with my bag on my lap and the sound of my father's name still ringing in my skull. No matter what, no matter who. Do not look back. The train carried me south through the night, past stations I didn't recognize, through stretches of darkness lit only by distant farmhouses. I changed trains twice, choosing routes that made no logical sense, doubling back once to break any pattern that might be traced. I paid in cash. I spoke to no one. I arrived at the coast when the sun was just beginning to touch the water. The village did not have a proper station, just a concrete slab beside the tracks with a faded sign that read, Marisola and nothing else. Nothing to suggest the world beyond had any interest in what lay past them. I stepped off and stood there for a long time, the sea pressing against my skin with every breath, filling the silence in a way that felt less like noise and more like permission. Permission to stop running, to breathe, to exist without calculating the next move. Marisola was small in a way that felt deliberate, as if it had decided long ago exactly how much of the world it was willing to accommodate. Stone houses built into the cliff face, their walls the color of sand and weather. A single winding road leading down to a harbor where fishing boats rocked against their moorings. No cameras, no checkpoints, no black sedans idling at corners. Just people, living lives that had nothing to do with power. The ceramics workshop sat halfway up the hill. The woman inside was shaping something on a wheel when I stepped through the open door, her hands slick with wet clay, her focus absolute. She didn't look up immediately. She finished the pull she was making. Slow, deliberate, coaxing the clay upward with a patience that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than skill. And only then did her eyes lift to mine. Orsola. I would learn her name later, along with the quiet history she carried. A husband lost to the sea, a daughter who moved north and rarely called, a life rebuilt around the simple certainty that making something with your hands was the closest thing to prayer she had ever found. But in that first moment, she simply looked at me the way certain people do when they have lived long enough to recognize damage without needing it explained. "You need somewhere to be?" she said. Not a question. Yes. She nodded toward a shelf stacked with unfired bowls. "Can you carry things without dropping them?" I almost laughed. Almost. Not reliably. Something softened in her expression. Not quite warmth, but the closest thing to it that I would receive for weeks. Good. The careful ones never last. Too afraid of breaking things to make anything worth keeping. She gave me work. Simple at first, carrying materials, cleaning tools, stacking shelves. My hands were clumsy with everything, the same way they had always been, fumbling with trays and misjudging distances, leaving small chips on edges that were supposed to be smooth. But she didn't correct me the way others had. She watched, adjusted, showed me once, and expected me to find my own way to the same result. The room above the workshop became mine. Small, sparse, barely more than a bed and a window that overlooked the harbor. The walls were bare stone, cool in the morning and warm by evening, and the sound of the sea came through the glass like something alive and constant. I lay there the first night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the village settle into darkness, and I waited for the fear to come. The certainty that he would find me, that men would appear on the road below, that a voice would call my name from the shadows that the distance I had built would collapse overnight. But the night passed, and then another, and another, and slowly, in increments so small they were almost invisible, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, I had disappeared completely. I should have known better. Disappearing is never permanent. It's just the silence before someone decides to start looking. 3 weeks in, my body started telling me things I didn't want to hear. It began the way most unwelcome truths begin, small enough to dismiss. A wave of nausea that hit while I was stacking clay in the back room, sharp and sudden, forcing me to grip the shelf and wait for the floor to stop tilting. I blamed the heat, the unfamiliar food. The stress still coiled in my muscles from weeks of running on nothing but fear and forward motion. But it didn't stop. Each morning brought it back stronger, more insistent, as if my body had decided that ignoring it was no longer an option it was willing to grant. The dizziness followed, sudden shifts in the room that had nothing to do with standing too quickly or sleeping too little. Something deeper, something biological, something that was changing the architecture of me from the inside. Orsola noticed before I said anything. She watched me pause mid-step one morning, my hand pressed flat against the doorframe, my face drained of color, and her expression turned into something I couldn't read. "How long?" she asked, her voice low. "How long what?" She didn't answer. She just looked at me with the patience of a woman who had carried her own truths long enough to recognize them in someone else. The clinic was at the bottom of the hill, a small stone building with salt-streaked windows and a doctor who looked like he had been part of the village since before the roads were paved. He asked few questions. He moved slowly, carefully, with the kind of gentleness that suggested he understood some patients came to him carrying more than symptoms. The test took minutes. The result took less. "You're pregnant." The words didn't land immediately. They hovered, suspended, like something thrown into the air that hadn't yet decided whether to fall. I stared at him, at the small paper in his hands, at the quiet certainty on his face, and for a long moment I felt nothing at all. Just a ringing blankness, like the space between a lightning flash and the thunder that follows. Then it hit, not as a single emotion, but as several at once, colliding inside me with a force that left no room to breathe. Fear, immediate, visceral, primal. A child, his child, growing inside me while I hid from him in a village he didn't know existed, in a life built on the specific premise that I would never see him again. I pressed my hand against my stomach, not because I could feel anything yet, but because the gesture felt necessary, like I was confirming something my mind still wanted to reject. "How far along?" My voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere outside of me. 6 weeks, possibly more. We'll need to confirm. 6 weeks, which meant this had started before the drawer, before the file, before the night my world split open. This had started during the good part, the part I was trying to bury, the part where I still believed that what we had was real and whole and uncorrupted. This child had been conceived in love, and that made everything worse. I walked back up the hill slowly, each step heavier than the last, the village stretching around me in a way that suddenly felt less like safety and more like a cage. Because the math was simple now, brutal in its clarity. If I stayed hidden, this child would grow up without a father, without a name, without any connection to the world it came from. And if Severo ever found out, if even a whisper of this reached Palermo, he wouldn't send men, he wouldn't negotiate, he wouldn't ask. He would come himself, and he would not leave without what was his. That was the night I understood something I had been avoiding since the train carried me south. Running was never going to be enough, because I was no longer alone in this. I was carrying the one thing a man like Severo would cross any distance to claim. I placed my hand against my stomach again, standing at the window of my small room, watching the harbor lights flicker against the dark water. "I'll keep you safe," I whispered. And I meant it the way only someone who has nothing left means anything. Completely, desperately, and with no idea how. The months that followed taught me what survival actually looks like when it's no longer just about you. It's not dramatic. It's not cinematic. It's waking up every morning with nausea pressing against the back of your throat and still dragging yourself downstairs to work, because the money you earn today is the only thing standing between your child and uncertainty. My body changed in ways I hadn't anticipated, not just the obvious ones, but the smaller shifts. The way my center of gravity moved, the way my clumsiness deepened into something almost comical. I broke more pieces in the workshop during those months than Orsola had lost in a decade. Bowls slipped from my hands, shelves were misjudged. Once, I knocked an entire drying rack sideways and stood in the middle of the wreckage, clay dust settling on my skin, and laughed until I couldn't breathe because the alternative was crying, and crying was a luxury I still couldn't afford. Orsola never complained. She swept up the fragments, set new pieces on the wheel, and said nothing except, "Once. The ones who break things are the ones who understand what it means to make something whole." I didn't know if that was wisdom or consolation. I took it anyway. The village accepted my growing belly the way it accepted everything, without questions, without judgment. Women I barely knew began leaving things at my door. A folded blanket, a jar of broth, a small knitted hat in pale yellow. That kindness nearly destroyed me more than anything else, because kindness requires you to feel, and feeling was the one thing I had been rationing since the night I left Palermo. He came on a Wednesday, not Severo, the baby, early, the way everything in my life had arrived, without permission and ahead of schedule. The first pain hit while I was closing the workshop, a contraction so sharp it folded me in half, my hands gripping the edge of the work table, my breath leaving me in a sound I didn't recognize as my own. Orsola found me like that, bent over, white-knuckled, and she didn't panic. She simply placed her hand on my back and said, "It's time." The clinic at the bottom of the hill had never handled a complicated birth. The doctor admitted this without pretense, his hands steady but his eyes betraying the kind of caution that comes from knowing the limits of what you can offer. But there was no time for alternatives, no hospital within reach that wouldn't ask questions I couldn't answer. This was happening here, in a village that barely had streetlights, with a woman who shaped clay and a doctor who still made house calls. The hours blurred. Pain folded into pain, each wave pulling me further from the version of myself that had existed before and pushing me towards something I wasn't sure I was ready to become. Orsola stayed beside me, her hand gripping mine with a strength that seemed impossible for her age, grounding me every time I felt the world start to slip away. And then, between one breath and the next, it was over. The cry came small at first, tentative, as if testing the space it had arrived in before deciding how much of it to fill. Then it grew, louder, fuller, a sound that cut through everything, the pain, the fear, the months of silence, and reached something inside me that I had been protecting so carefully I had almost forgotten it was there. They placed him in my arms. He was impossibly small. Red-faced, furious, his tiny hands clenched into fists like he had arrived with grievances already prepared. His hair was dark, impossibly dark, and his features, even in those first raw moments, carried a sharpness that didn't belong to me. I knew whose face I was looking at. I had spent 11 months memorizing it. My breath caught. My arms tightened around him instinctively, pulling him closer, as if proximity could protect him from the truth of whose blood ran through him. He opened his eyes, unfocused, searching, and something inside me gave way. Not in destruction, but in the way a seed gives way, making room for something that needs more space than the shell can hold. I named him Renzo. It means laurel, the ancient symbol of something earned through endurance, because that was what he was. Not an accident, not a complication, not a consequence. He was the thing I had earned by surviving. Orsola stood at the edge of the room, watching, her eyes glistening in a way she would later deny. He has a strong grip, she said softly, watching his fingers curl around mine. He does. Like someone who doesn't plan on letting go. I looked at her. She looked back. And in that silence, we both understood what neither of us said. He looked like his father. And no amount of distance would ever change that. The first thing Severo noticed was the silence, not the absence of sound. His world was never truly quiet, but the absence of her particular kind of noise, the soft collision of objects being rearranged, the faint curse under her breath when something slipped from her fingers, the rhythm of someone moving through a space they had made their own without asking permission. By morning, the silence had weight. By afternoon, it had teeth. He found her desk untouched, her coat gone, her bag gone. The small tangerine she kept on the corner of her workspace, a habit he had never questioned and secretly found grounding. Gone. Everything personal, removed with a precision that felt rehearsed. He called her phone. It rang until it didn't. He called again. Same result. By the third attempt, the line was dead entirely. Severo Catanese was not a man who panicked. Panic was a failure of preparation, and preparation was the architecture of his entire existence. But what moved through him in the hours that followed was something adjacent to panic, something quieter but far more dangerous. A slow, methodical disassembly of every certainty he had built his life around. He sent Ennio first, his underboss, his closest confidant, the man who had been at his side since the early years when loyalty was the only currency that mattered. Find her. Bring her back. Simple instructions, the kind he had given 1,000 times about 1,000 different problems. Ennio returned with nothing. No trace, no sighting, no trail. She had vanished the way only someone who understood observation could vanish. By exploiting every blind spot, every assumption, every gap in attention that powerful men never think to guard because they're too busy watching for threats that look like threats. She hadn't looked like a threat. She had looked like a girl who dropped things. That was what haunted him. Weeks bled into months. The search consumed resources that should have been directed elsewhere. Operations delayed, alliances strained, attention fractured in ways that left openings he would have never tolerated before. Men who had worked for him for years began exchanging glances they thought he couldn't see. Not doubt exactly, but something worse. Concern. They were watching their boss unravel over a secretary. But she had never been just a secretary. He knew that. They knew that. The entire building had known it from the night they found him standing at her empty desk at 3 in the morning, his hand resting on the surface where hers had been, his expression carrying something that no one in his world had the vocabulary to name. He stopped sleeping in the apartment. He couldn't explain why, only that the rooms felt architecturally wrong without her in them, as if the walls had shifted just enough to make every familiar angle feel foreign. He worked instead, burning through the hours between midnight and dawn with a focus that should have been productive, but was mostly just a dressed-up version of avoidance. The questions started later, not about her, but about the night she left. Small details that hadn't seemed important before, but now sat in his mind like stones in a current, redirecting everything around them. The key to his private drawer. He kept it in his jacket. Always. A habit so ingrained it required no thought. But that night, after the meeting, it was on his desk, beside his coffee cup. Visible. Accessible. He hadn't placed it there. The realization came slowly at first, then all at once, the way understanding does when it's been waiting for you to stop looking in the wrong direction. Someone had moved the key. Someone who knew what was in that drawer. Someone who wanted it found. And the only person with access to his office, his schedule, and his private spaces besides Miren, was the man he had trusted most. The man he had sent to find her. Severo did not confront Ennio immediately. That was not how men in his position survived, by reacting before they understood. Instead, he did what he had always done when the ground beneath him shifted. He went quiet. He watched. He waited. And he began to pull threads. It started with the file itself, the document connecting him to Miren's father's death. A man named Giotto, a pharmacist from the northern coast who had refused to serve as a distribution point for a supply line Severo had never authorized. The order had been executed cleanly, professionally, attributed to the organization without question. Severo's name was on it, his signature, his seal. But the signature was wrong. Not obviously, not in any way that would catch casual scrutiny, but wrong in the way only the person whose hand it was supposed to belong to would notice. A pressure point shifted, a letter angled differently, the kind of detail that only mattered to a man who had spent his life understanding that precision was the difference between control and chaos. He hadn't signed it. He had never seen it. The thread led to logistics. Who had handled the file? Who had archived it? Who had access to the drawer where it was stored? Each question peeled back another layer, and each layer pointed in the same direction, not outward, not toward rivals or enemies, but inward, toward the one place he had never thought to look. Ennio, the man who had stood beside him for 15 years, the man who had helped build the infrastructure that held 3 provinces together, the man who had sat across from him the morning after Miren disappeared, and said, with perfect steadiness, "She was always going to leave, Severo. Women like that don't belong in our world." Severo remembered that sentence now with a clarity that tasted like iron. The truth, when it finally assembled itself, did not arrive with drama. It arrived in a locked room in the basement of a building that didn't officially exist, spoken by a man who had handled logistics for Ennio's private operations and had always assumed he was too insignificant to be noticed. The pharmacist, Giotto, Miren's father, had been killed on Ennio's orders, not Severo's. Ennio had used the organization's infrastructure to execute a personal operation, eliminating a man who had threatened to report irregularities in a side business Severo knew nothing about. The documentation had been forged afterward, placed in Severo's private files as insurance, a buried weapon to be activated if it was ever needed. And it had been needed. The moment Ennio realized that Miren was no longer just a secretary. The moment he understood that Severo's attachment to her was not a phase, but a vulnerability. The key had been left on the desk deliberately, positioned like bait for a woman Ennio knew was incapable of ignoring details. He had weaponized her gift against her. He had used the very thing that made her irreplaceable, her compulsion to notice, to look, to understand, and turned it into the instrument of her departure. The logistics man stopped talking. The room stayed silent. Severo sat motionless, his hands flat on the table, his breathing controlled in a way that was more terrifying than any visible anger. 3 years. He had spent 3 years tearing the world apart looking for a woman who had been driven away by the man sitting in his inner circle, advising his search, shaping his decisions, watching him deteriorate with the patient satisfaction of someone who had already won. Ennio did not disappear quickly. That would have been mercy, and mercy was not what Severo was offering. The dismantling was methodical, thorough, and almost surgical. Every operation Ennio had built was exposed, unraveled, and absorbed. Every ally was given a choice that was not really a choice. Every financial thread was traced, severed, and redirected. Ennio himself vanished on a Tuesday morning from a car that was later found empty on a road that led nowhere. No one asked questions. In their world, the absence of questions was its own kind of answer. It should have been enough. The betrayal identified, the traitor removed, the truth restored. But truth, Severo discovered, is only useful if the person who needs it most is there to hear it. Mirren was still gone. His office was still empty. And the silence that had begun the morning she left had not diminished. It had only grown louder. He stood in his office that night, in the exact spot where she used to sit, and understood something that no amount of power could soften. He had been fighting the wrong war for 3 years. The enemy had been beside him the entire time. And the woman who had paid the price for his blindness was out there somewhere, believing with absolute certainty that the man she had loved had killed her father. That belief was a wall higher than any he had ever faced. And he had no idea how to tear it down. It was not a grand discovery. There was no intercepted message, no informant, no sophisticated surveillance yielding results after months of effort. It was a ceramic bowl, a gallery in Catania, small, independent, the kind of place that showcased local artisans and survived on tourists who wanted something authentic to carry home. Had posted its new collection online, 12 photographs of handmade ceramics, each one tagged with the name of the artist and the village of origin. The 11th photograph showed a bowl, slightly uneven, glazed in a shade of deep blue that caught the light unevenly, beautifully imperfect. The kind of piece that announced itself as handmade not through flaws but through character. The artist was listed as M. Rinaldi, a name that meant nothing to anyone. But the village of origin read Marisola, Severo's man, the one tasked with scanning every database, every listing, and every digital footprint that might connect to a woman who had made herself invisible. Almost dismissed it. Almost scrolled past it, the way anyone would scroll past a ceramic bowl on a regional gallery page. But the initial stopped him. M, and the work itself. Slightly uneven, beautifully imperfect. Made by hands that created through instinct rather than precision. The photograph was sent without commentary. When Severo opened it, he stared at it for a long time, not at the bowl. At the slight reflection in the glaze, the ghost of a window behind the photographer, the suggestion of a workshop interior that told him nothing and everything at once. He didn't send men. 3 years had taught him what sending others meant. Distance, delay, another chance for her to vanish into a silence he might never break through again. He drove alone, south, past the cities, past the highways, past the infrastructure of his own influence, until the roads narrowed and the world became something older, quieter, unconcerned with the machinery of power. Marisola appeared the way she must have found it, suddenly, unexpectedly, carved into the cliffs like something the sea had decided to spare. He arrived before dawn, the village still wrapped in darkness and the smell of brine, and he sat in the car for a long time, his hands on the wheel, his chest tight with something he didn't have a name for. 3 years of searching, 3 years of silence, 3 years of waking up in a world that felt structurally incomplete. And now a ceramic bowl had led him to a village that didn't appear on any map that mattered. He stepped out into the cold. He walked. He found the cottage halfway up the hill by following the faint smell of clay and the even fainter glow of a kitchen light that shouldn't have been on at that hour. And when the door opened and she stood there, changed, hardened, holding a boy with his jaw and his eyes, the distance between who he had been and who he was now collapsed into a silence that was louder than anything he had ever known. We know what happened next. The door closed. The lock turned. And the most powerful man in Sicily sat down on the wet stone and chose to wait. But this time, the audience understands why. He did not leave. That was what the village noticed first, though none of them said it directly. Marisola was not the kind of place that confronted strangers. It observed them quietly, from behind curtains and over morning coffee, gathering information the way tide pools gather water. Slowly, passively, but with surprising completeness. He rented a room at the bottom of the hill, A fisherman's spare quarters, bare enough that the bed and chair felt like a monk's cell, rather than a place where a man who owned half of Palermo slept. He didn't bring guards. He brought nothing except himself, stripped down to the most basic version of a man terrified of losing something by reaching too quickly. The first few days, she pretended he wasn't there. Severo kept his distance, always visible but never approaching, never crossing the boundaries she had drawn with her silence. It was Renzo who broke the pattern. On the fourth morning, walking past where Severo sat outside the small cafe, the boy stopped. Miren tugged gently, but he planted his feet with quiet stubbornness. "You're the lost man," Renzo said, looking up at Severo. Severo's throat tightened. "I am." "Did you find your home yet?" "I'm still looking." Renzo reached into his pocket and produced a small, lopsided clay figure. Rough, uneven, painted in colors that didn't quite match. "You can hold this," he said, placing it on the table. "It helps when you're lost." Miren pulled him away gently, her face unreadable, but something in her step had changed. A fraction slower, a fraction less certain, as if the ground beneath her conviction had shifted by the smallest, most dangerous degree. Days accumulated. Severo learned the rhythms of the village and helped where he could, carrying crates at the harbor, fixing a shutter that had been broken for months, doing things with his hands that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with presence. The villagers watched. Then, gradually, they stopped watching. 2 weeks after he arrived, Miren spoke to him again. Evening, the light falling soft across the harbor, Renzo skipping stones at the water's edge. "You killed my father." Level, controlled, carrying 3 years of certainty. "I didn't. I saw the file, your signature." The signature was forged. He told her everything. Ennio's unauthorized operation, her father's refusal to cooperate, the forged documents buried in his files as insurance. The key left on the desk deliberately, positioned like bait for a woman who was incapable of ignoring details. "He weaponized your gift against you," Severo said, his voice low. "He wanted you to see exactly what you saw. He wanted you to leave." The words hung in the evening wind. "He's gone now," Severo added. Not with satisfaction, with finality. She turned away, not in rejection, but in the way a person turns when they need to reorganize everything they thought they knew. 3 more days passed. 3 days of quiet, of distance, of something shifting beneath the surface that neither of them could control. Then Renzo got sick. The fever came fast, the way fevers do in small children. A sudden spike that turned his small body into something frighteningly fragile within hours. Miren moved with the practiced efficiency of a mother who had handled every crisis alone, but this one climbed higher, faster, resisting every measure she applied. She didn't call Severo. He was at the door before she could reach the phone. He didn't ask permission. He stepped inside, knelt beside the small bed, and placed his hand against Renzo's forehead with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man his size. He spoke quietly. Not words, but sounds, low and rhythmic, the kind of instinctive murmuring that belongs to fathers who don't know they're doing it. Renzo's breathing slowed. The fever didn't break immediately, but the fear did. The particular terror that comes from facing something alone that was never meant to be faced alone. She stood in the doorway watching, tears she hadn't permitted in 3 years finally falling without permission. This was what had been taken. Not just time, not just years, but this. The quiet, unremarkable miracle of a father holding his child through the worst of it, steady and present and refusing to let go. When Renzo finally slept, Severo didn't move. He stayed beside the bed, his head bowed, like a man in prayer, or surrender, or both. Miren sat down beside him, not close, but closer than she had been in 3 years. "I'm tired," she said finally. Her voice barely held. He waited. I'm tired of carrying everything alone. I'm tired of being the only wall between him and the world. I'm tired of believing something that doesn't feel true anymore. He turned to look at her. Not reaching, not pushing, just present. You don't have to carry it alone anymore, he said. That choice was made for you by someone who wanted you gone. She didn't fall into him. She didn't collapse. She leaned, just slightly, just enough for her shoulder to touch his, and stayed there, breathing, letting the contact exist without demanding it become anything more than what it was. A beginning, small and fragile and imperfect. Like a ceramic bowl made by hands that had always been better at breaking things than building them. It did not happen all at once. Forgiveness is not a door that opens. It is a season that changes so gradually you only notice it has arrived when the landscape looks different. He stayed, mornings walking Renzo to school, the boy between them, one hand in each of theirs, chattering about crabs and boats. Evenings at the harbor, Renzo on Severo's shoulders, pointing at things with the authority of a child who believed the entire sea existed for his inspection. Orsola watched from the workshop with the expression of a woman who had seen enough of life to know that some things repair themselves if you leave them alone long enough. He's not who I thought he was, Mirren said one afternoon. No, Ursula agreed. He's who he is when everything else is taken away. That's the only version that matters. The truth about her father settled slowly. The loosening of a fist that had been clenched so long the muscles had forgotten any other shape. She visited the small church one morning, alone, and let the grief she had weaponized into anger finally become what it had always been. Just grief. Just loss. She cried. Not for long, but enough. Severo didn't ask about it. He didn't need to. He simply stood at the harbor that evening, waiting for her, and when she arrived, he handed her a coffee and said nothing, and the nothing was exactly right. Renzo asked the question on a Sunday, directly, without warning, the way children ask the questions adults spend years avoiding. Are you my papa? They were sitting on the stone wall above the harbor, all three of them, the sea stretching beneath them in silver and blue. Severo's hands went still. Mirren's breath caught. Severo looked at Mirren. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once, barely perceptible. But enough. Yes, Severo said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 years of absence and the fragile hope of every year that might follow. I am. Renzo considered this with his usual seriousness. Then he reached into his pocket and produced another small clay figure, just as rough and lopsided as the first. I made you another one, he said, placing it in Severo's hand. So you don't get lost again. Severo closed his fingers around it. His jaw tightened. His eyes glistened in a way that he would later blame on the wind off the water, though no one in that village had ever seen the sea make a man's hands tremble. There was no ceremony. What happened instead was simpler, and, because of that, more binding than anything written on paper. One evening, after Renzo had fallen asleep with both clay figures on his windowsill like sentinels, Mirren stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Severo, who was washing dishes with the focused incompetence of a man who had clearly never done it before. You're terrible at that, she said. I'm learning. You're breaking more than you're cleaning. I'll buy new ones. That's not the point. He turned to look at her, soap on his hands, water on his shirt. Every trace of the man who had commanded provinces stripped away until all that remained was someone standing in a small kitchen, trying. What is the point? He asked. She crossed the room, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the steady certainty of someone who had made a decision that had been building for weeks, maybe longer. She took the dish from his hand, set it down, and stood in front of him, close enough that the distance between them was no longer a question, but an answer. The point, she said, is that you stay. Not because you're powerful, not because you owe me, not because of him. Because this kitchen, this village, this life that doesn't look like anything you've ever known, is where you choose to be. He looked at her, the woman who had walked into his office with a tangerine and no fear. The woman who had noticed everything except how much she mattered. This is where I choose to be, he said. She kissed him. Not the way people kiss in stories. Not desperately. Not hungrily. She kissed him the way the tide meets the shore at dusk. Gently, slowly, like something that had always been happening and had only just been noticed. And in a small cottage on a cliff in a village that didn't appear on any map that mattered, a family broken by lies and distance was quietly, imperfectly, stubbornly rebuilt. Not because the past had been erased, but because what remained, when the power was gone, when the fear was spent, when the armor was finally set down, was enough. It had always been enough.